Depending on who you are, King Arthur likely brings up many different images and associations. For most, he's a chivalrous knight, the king of Camelot, a warrior in shining armor who fights against the forces of evil and is ultimately slain and laid to rest until he one day will awake again to rule his mythical kingdom. For some who are a little more researched on King Arthur maybe, or just a little bit more interested or happened upon some more info, they may think of him as a 7th century Celtic warlord from Wales, or what was then Brythonic England, who fought off repeat invasions of Utes and Germans who were conquering his lands. I've been interested in King Arthur for as long as I can remember, and I've read all sorts of material on him, and I've been interested in ascertaining the true identity of King Arthur for a long time, which I know is a bit like the quest for the Holy Grail in that it's very difficult. But I find that on the internet there's so many varying views of who he is, partially because it's not 100% set who he is. It's a bit of a mystery, which is what makes him so attractive. But I found certainly that he's not a 7th century Celtic warlord. There was a warlord in the 7th century in England, what is now England, who was named Arthur, who may have associated his kingship with the figure of Arthur. But it seems quite clear to me that there's a lot of evidence that Arthur has woven within his character and in his history a deity figure. People who think Arthur is a Christian figure often have read things like Morte D'Arthur, which is written by Sir Thomas Malory, a Frenchman, which were written in a culture in medieval Europe where the church was hegemonic, had control over every aspect of people's lives. And so the literature that came out of that era inevitably included some of those themes. But it would be a mistake to think that the root of Arthur is a Christian knight. That was the people of Europe's way of relativizing his story to their new culture, which was Latin Christianity. If you've read much Christian literature at all, it becomes immediately obvious when you read the King Arthur story that something's a little off as far as Christian literature. Yes, he'll consistently mention or say things like Christian prayers, and he'll go to churches, and he's in the stories we have, he seems to be quite a Christian man. But if you read Pilgrim's Progress, if you read Imitation of Christ, if you read the Church Fathers, if you read Christian literature, you'll find there's not a lot of magic in it. You'll find there's not a lot of sorcery, swords being bestowed from women lying in ponds. Those things belong to the pagan memory of Europe. And if you've studied pagan symbolism and mythology, it's really clear that it's woven throughout the Arthurian tales deeply. And so this begs the question, what happened? And what is the truth of Arthur? Because it's obvious that a lot of the literature we have today, just like unfortunately a lot of the literature we have on many ancient societies, has been kind of siphoned through this Christian lens, passed through a filter, and it's come out the other side. And one must give credit. Without these writers, these monks, these men who wrote down a lot of these ancient tales, like in the case of the Eddas, which were recorded by Snorri Sturluson, yes, they propagandized slightly what they wrote down, and yes, they put their human biases into them, but without these men, we wouldn't have even the fragments we have. It's fair to say that if certain monks, men, and writers hadn't taken the pen to paper in that time, these stories would be lost forever. So I'm not hating on the writers. It's just important to understand their biases. And so yeah, Sir Thomas Malory was biased. It's kind of funny to read it because it'll go from one scene to the next with sorcery and magic and witchcraft, and then to the next they're in church. And it's almost feverish because there's no real world examples of Christian communities behaving like that. And in fact, if you look into medieval Europe and its history, sorcery and magic kind of had a bad rap. Not necessarily always among the public. In the rural communities, wise women and wise men were fairly common who would work charms and incantations to alleviate various illnesses. That was considered sort of a white magic, and they would usually think that the healing power came from God, it was almost viewed like a science, right? So it's not so much a sorcery. They were just thinking, if the wise woman or man did A, B, and C, your gout, your stomach problems, your cancers, your tumors would go away. It was very much formulaic. But as far as actual avowed sorcery, like what Merlin represents, like what the Lady of the Lake represents, her kind of feminine spiritual energy, that was not popular in medieval Europe. And so it's a strange thing to read the stories, and I want to discuss what happened. I've been looking into the history of Arthur, the etymology of Arthur. I've read some interesting articles. This isn't all my work at all. In fact, a lot of people have gone far before me and done a lot more work. But it seems to me I can be very confident that Arthur is the remnants of a religious practice from Celtic Brythonic Britain, which is exciting because Brythonic England we know very little about. Very little. We have archaeological digs. We know that certain rivers were named after certain goddesses, certain holy wells. So we know that there was an association between femininity and water. So that's interesting. We know that they had kingships that were considered religious in significance. So their royal lines were often traced back to deities. But as far as the nitty-gritty, the names of a few gods we have, Aron, the god of death, is one of my favorite. He's a very interesting figure in the Mabinogion. We're actually relatively left in want for information on the Brythons. And so I think that by studying this character, we can get closer to the truth of what those people believed. But it takes a lot of tact, and you have to be careful because of the biases that have been imparted on the story. I just wanted to say really quick, because I believe it's important for contextual purposes, that the differences between Celts and Germans were overplayed by the Romans. They actually often shared deities and religious practices, and indeed they came from the same root. So that's just important to understand for this next part of the video. I have a few theories on who Arthur could be as far as a deity. It has been pointed out by many people that Arthur has its roots in a word Arthur, which was bear, and so some figure maybe he was a bear god. But it also is very obvious in the Arthurian cycle that there's a lot of solar aspects to Arthur, woven right throughout his character, from the round table that he sits at to the kingship. Arthur has this solar energy to him. And so it seems possible that he was a sun god. And bears aren't traditionally associated with sun. In fact, bears are associated more with the sleepy, like kind of chthonic aspects of life because of their going into the ground for hibernation every year. But of course, to fully understand Arthur, we can't just look at Arthur alone. We have to look at his compatriots and peers, which again leads to a very clear picture of a sort of pagan pantheon. From Merlin, Arthur's well-known magical companion, who embodies really almost this Odinic archetype of the wandering wizard, the wild madman. In medieval Europe, Merlin was considered a devil. He was considered the son of Satan, born from Satan, which is, if you look at, usually when something gets passed through the Christian filter and made into a devil, it's almost always pagan in origin. Or maybe not specifically a devil. You have people like Saint Brigid, who comes from the Irish or Celtic goddess Brigid. And in their story, she's a ex-prostitute and the son of a pagan abusive father. So where there are pagan origins to things, you will usually find in the Christian lens a very negative coin flip on it. It's a clue. And so the fact that Merlin was considered the son of the devil in medieval Europe definitely alludes to some kind of pagan association, which wouldn't have been lost on medieval Europeans. They would be aware that, a magician, a hooded wanderer is very pagan in theme. And then you have sort of a death goddess figure in Morgan, which we can definitely see comparisons to the Morgan, the Celtic goddess. You have the Lady in the Lake, which goes back to that association between femininity, water, and divinity. And even the Kingdom of Camelot itself is very similar to anyone who has studied the Mabinogion to the otherworldly Celtic kingdom of Annuin, which is led by a king named Pwyll and or Aran, but then Aran hands over leadership to Pwyll for some time. So these symbols, this Arthurian story, is set deeply in Celtic mythos, and I strongly believe that's not a mistake or a coincidence. My theory, my working theory, is that Arthur is Odin, as far as the same way that Odin is Woden. If you know that in Scandinavia, Odin took on a slightly different character than Woden in Germany, but it was the same god. He was just being expressed through different peoples. Some people would disagree with me that on a spiritual level. If you have a religion that makes you disagree with that, I'm not trying to disrespect anything, but it seems quite obvious that Woden is Odin. And I believe in a similar way that Woden is Odin, Odin is Arthur. Now, there are a few reasons for this. First off, there's the kingship of Arthur, and Odin is the god of kings. That's a small thing. Second is etymology. Yes, there's Arthur, which is bear. There's also a Scandinavian spelling of Allfather, which is Arthur. And it's very conceivable that the word Allfather would etymologically shift to Arthur. And additionally, the character of Merlin, it's debated. A lot of people think Merlin is Odin, which I think is fair, but I think in a lot of pagan gods, there's threes. And in paganism, there's this concept of the young man, the adult warrior, and the old sage, the kind of tripartite sequence of a man's life. And you can see all three of those expressed in the Arthurian fables. So you have Arthur the boy pulling the sword from the stone. He's full of vigor, youth, his eyes are bright, he's looking to the future. You have Arthur the king bearing the crown. He's got the burden of leadership. It's about responsibility now, but he's also a warrior. And then you have Merlin, the old wise sage, the wanderer. It's not too unconceivable that these are expressions of one person. And you do find these expressions in Odinic symbolism. So, why is this important? I think it's important because the mainstream, not consensus, but theory put forward right now is that Arthur is simply a 7th century Celtic warlord and that he got mythologized. I think it's far more likely that the 7th century Celtic warlord took on the name or claimed divine lineage from Arthur, which it wouldn't be that abnormal. It's important because we have so few hints to this culture and their religion and their spiritual beliefs. These are literally just about it. The Mabinogion and the Morte D'Arthur and related literature, that if we start to conceive that this is all just made up in the 7th century, we're losing a line of inquiry that could illumine a lot about this culture. So I'm sure some of you have theories on who Arthur is. I'd be very interested to hear them. Perhaps one of the most important hints at his divinity is the dying king archetype who will rise again. Of course, we know Odin is famously fated to die in Ragnarok. I have some questions about the way that we interpret that. I'm not sure that we understand his death in the same way that Norsemen would have understood his death. But it is a thing that he is fated to be either temporarily or permanently defeated in Ragnarok in an apocalyptic battle against the forces of evil. And as we also know, Arthur, when you start reading any Arthurian cycle, Arthur is doomed to die. Arthur will die, and he's laid to rest in a mountain where he will one day rise again and rule in a golden age. The dying god archetype is one of the oldest and strongest, the dying and rising god. And it's very interesting that it's expressed here through Arthur. If this was simply copying a real person, they wouldn't have the expectation of that person rising up again in 1,000 years to save the peoples of England. That's a very divine prophecy. So I would posit and put forward as an interesting explanation that just about every character in the Arthurian cycle has their roots in some form of pagan divinity. Whether it's Sir Kay, who is said to get so angry, so full of fury, that he's almost on fire. He's boiling. Sounds like a fire deity. Morgan, who is the evil, dark underworld character. Lancelot, the chivalrous, almost Tyr-like character, but who is ultimately tempted. All these characters have their roots in divinity, and so that's a very exciting thing for the study of the Brythons. One of my materials that I've enjoyed gleaning information from the most has been King Arthur and the Gods of the Round Table by David Dom. David Dom is a religiously interested person in this topic. He's a druid in England, so there is a bit of a like a bias. Everyone has a bias. There's a spiritual bias, and he's very desirous of finding the spiritual roots of these tales. But the book really illumined for me how the Arthurian tale incorporates solar cycles. Some of you may know about in pagan symbology, the Holly King and the Oak King. So there's the king that rules in the winter and the king that rules in the summer. That kind of idea of a king in the summer shining brightly and radiantly and then going to sleep in the winter. David Dom does a good job of relegating or relating the Arthur dying and being laid to rest in the hill to a sun god dying and rising every year mythology, which is fascinating and leads to his solar aspect quite deeply. This book is really good, especially if you want to understand solar religion and how the Arthurian tales incorporate a lot of aspects of solar religion, including Arthur having foes who definitely embody the nighttime, embody the opposite of a solar aspect. They're low, chthonic, people say her name many different ways. Hecate, Hecat, however you want to say it. There are characters in the Arthurian legend, like the Morgan or Mordred, who embody that graveyard aspect, that down under aspect, and Arthur's in a battle with those forces. Very solar, and that's fascinating because solar gods are universal, and so it's not hard to think that the Brythonic people would have a solar god. And so to see those aspects expressed in this tale, incorporating Brythonic culture, it seems quite likely, including a long list of place names that seem to have Arthur in England in their etymological origin. It seems quite likely that the Brythonic people honored very much a solar deity, which, if you've ever been to England, makes sense because they get like 3 days of sun a year, so they must have loved when he showed up. So in my opinion, to answer the question, did King Arthur really exist? Yes. As maybe the Inkhearts would have agreed, Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and them, myth is truth. The separation is arbitrary. We use myth to speak about truths that are eternal. And so King Arthur is just as real as Jesus, in the sense that whether you agree with Jesus being real or not, the figure has a bearing and a reality that is in our minds. We're aware that archetype, that person, is real for effectual purposes. I just do not believe that he's real in the sense that he walked on 2 feet in the 7th century. I think that actually reduces him. It's less than what he was. He was much larger than that and much more important to the Celtic peoples. I plan on doing a lot more videos on this topic, hopefully expounding, explaining, delving into this topic. I have a lot of material that I could get through, and I don't want to, this channel is called Mythical Meanderings for a reason, because I like to meander, but I don't want to just bombard. But needless to say, this is a fascinating topic, which honestly I could burn out YouTube's server storage with the amount of videos you could make on the Arthurian cycle, its impact on our psyche, its impact on our societies, its history, and its origins. So I hope that interests you, and thanks for listening to my mythical meanderings. Please like and subscribe if you liked it, and if not, have a good one.